The Arctic ice is melting. Sea levels are rising, and the climate crisis is accelerating. In these challenging times, the world needs Indigenous wisdom, conscious leadership, and radical acts of hope. After all, climate change is not just about scientific data. It's about relationships, to the land, to each other, and to the future. Welcome to A Radical Act of Hope. In this series, Inuk climate advocate Siila Watt-Cloutier brings us into her world, a world where melting ice isn't just a symptom of climate change. It's a disruption of memory, identity, and the rhythms of life in the North. She takes us from her home in the Arctic to the front lines of international climate justice, alongside those who have been speaking up and holding steady for decades.
The environment and climate I grew up in was indeed rich in lessons, and not just those that built character or help us on a hunt. Our intense affinity with the land and with wildlife taught us how to live in harmony with the natural world. All this wisdom, too, is threatened by the changing climate. That is to say, if we allow the Arctic to melt, we lose more than the planet that has nurtured us for all of human history. We lose the wisdom required for us to sustain it. And when I say I do not mean only Inuit, it's true. We are already among the first to be devastated by climate change, but we are not the only ones. Everything is connected through our common atmosphere, not to mention our common spirit and humanity. What affects one affects us all. The Arctic, after all, is the cooling system, the air conditioner, if you will, for the entire planet. As its ice and snow disappear, the globe's temperature rises faster.
My name is Janna Wale. I'm Gitxsan from Gitimax First Nation on my dad's side and Cree Métis on my mother's side. I work as the Indigenous Research and Partnerships Lead at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. I'll be joining you on this journey with Siila, who reminds us that climate work isn't only technical or political. It's also spiritual, emotional, and deeply personal. Together, we'll reflect on her incredible legacy and explore what it means to carry wisdom forward across generations and through this moment of global transformation. After publishing her first book, The Right to Be Cold, Siila has entered a new chapter in life and in leadership. She has more to share, and in this space of reflection and care, we listen. This isn't just a climate story. It's a story about the connection between people and place, and all that sustains us.
A Radical Act of Hope is a collaboration between Siila Watt-Cloutier and the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, or PICS, at the University of Victoria. My name is Ian Mauro, and as the Executive Director of PICS, I'm honored to join you as we listen to the powerful voice of my friend and colleague, Siila.
We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory this podcast was produced, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day.
At the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, relationship is at the heart of what we do. We work to support climate action through research and partnership, but also through trust, reciprocity, and respect.
I'm Ian Mauro, and I'm a professor in environmental studies at the University of Victoria, and I'm the executive director of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, which is an organization that does bridging work. It brings together 4 major universities, UVic, Simon Fraser University, University of British Columbia, and University of Northern British Columbia, to take the best of that climate research that's being done at these institutions, to leverage it, to mobilize it, to get it into community, to help change the world, to really take on this existential challenge of climate change and try to put good ideas into action.
We believe the climate crisis isn't something to solve in isolation. It requires collaboration, humility, and a deep attention to the communities and knowledge systems that have sustained us and this land long before the language of solutions even existed. Our work is shaped by the belief that climate leadership must be grounded in place, in practice, and in relationship.
The Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions is a unique entity in the world. We have an endowment that gives us a foundation and a platform of independence. And so we have the opportunity to think generationally in a very real way. We have an opportunity to think about what do we need to do to actually get this right.
In 2024, PICS invited Siila Watt-Cloutier to be the inaugural Indigenous Climate Fellow. Siila is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, a lifelong advocate, and a global leader who has helped to shift the way the world understands climate change, not just as science, but also as it intersects with human rights. For her to become the inaugural PICS Climate Fellow was a chance for us to get it right when we look to the future.
Well, Siila Watt-Cloutier is an important figure, not just in Canada, but the world. She is one of the world's most decorated advocates for the environment, culture, and human rights. She is a voice for humanity. But more importantly than that, her voice at this particular moment, this calm determination around, the future of how climate and climate leadership should be part of the conversation right now, it's essential. It is literally essential. We need to be thinking very carefully right now. We're at a critical moment in planetary history. We're at a critical moment in human history. We are at a critical moment in geopolitical history in a very real way. The Arctic is being potentially carved up right now for trade routes, for critical minerals, for all kinds of geopolitical positioning. And it's Inuit territory. It's home to Indigenous people. And Siila's voice right now in this context is tremendously important. And so we actually created at PICS an inaugural Indigenous Climate Fellow position. And we recruited Siila because this is the kind of organization we want to be. We want to lift up the voices of people that need to be heard. We want to lift up the voices of Indigenous people who have wisdom to share. And this position allowed Siila to be in a space where she could share that wisdom, share that knowledge. And when you talk about climate change in different languages, Inuktitut, which Siila speaks, it helps us understand the world in a different kind of way. And so diversity of language, diversity of ways of knowing, diversity of what problems look like and the different opportunities for solutions. We need imagination. We need all of these things right now. And Siila embodies a lot of the things that I would suggest the world needs. And so this podcast is an opportunity for us to share that message and to honor somebody who has made a tremendous difference. That we're going to talk about her career. We're going to talk about what she's done. She has literally changed the world, the way we think about it and the way we act in it. And who wouldn't want to follow someone who is guiding that kind of path for us?
This podcast collaboration is a long time in the making. It's the culmination of not only decades of Siila's advocacy at regional, national, and global levels, it is also a symbolic reunion of two friends.
I started making films as a way to communicate science and as a way to connect with audiences and as a way to start conversations about what kind of world we want to live in. In my mid-20s, I was finishing my environmental science degree, and I took a travel study course to the Canadian Arctic to a place called Pangnirtung in Nunavut, or Panituk in Inuktitut. And that is where I was introduced to the Inuit way of life. I got to go on the land hunting with elders, and I started to see climate change with my own eyeballs. And from that summer, that first summer, I was invited back as a university professor on that course to teach that course or part of that course. And it was through that experience that I've come to realize that climate change is the biggest issue of our time. And I spent the better part of a decade in the early 2000s living every summer in Pangnirtung, teaching on this course, building relationship, building community, teaching students about the changes that were coming, learning from Inuit, from elders and hunters and knowledge keepers on the land who are the experts about what was actually going on. And I was actually invited by an elder named Joannes Karpik to make this part of my journey, my career. And he said, Ian, you know a lot about the place, you know a lot about what's going on. Have you considered devoting your life to working on climate change and supporting communities like Pangnirtung? And so I did a postdoc on Inuit knowledge and climate change with the great Inuk filmmaker Zacharias Kunuk, who made Atanajuat the Fast Runner. It's considered the most important Canadian film ever made. It was the world's first Indigenous language feature film. And I met Zach at a conference, and I'm a Kalinak, or a settler, a white guy that knows how to speak enough Inuktitut, as I say, to get myself into trouble. And Zach basically was like, Kauyasakti, which is scientist. Like, what kind of scientist are you? You're speaking Inuktitut, like you seem to know what's going on. And we hit it off. And so we decided to make the world's first Inuktitut language film on climate change called Keperhangayuk, Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change. And I made that as part of my postdoc actually at the University of Victoria. And that is how I met Siila Watt-Cloutier.
I was born in Fort Chimo, a Hudson's Bay Company post. The community now is better known as Kuujjuaq in Nunavik, in the northern part of Quebec. And I was born in Old Fort Chimo across the river, very traditional. We lived very humbly with no running water, no electricity, just a little home. And I was born into a family of two single mothers, a grandmother and a mother. And they are the only two parents I've ever known. And we lived very traditionally, traveling by dog team in the winter and canoe by summer.
When her book, The Right to Be Cold, was published in 2015, it brought together family, community, politics, and the North itself. It's a story that makes clear climate change is not only about rising temperatures. It's about language, culture, and survival.
The environment and climate I grew up in was indeed rich in lessons, not just those that built character or help us on a hunt. Our intense affinity with the land and with wildlife taught us how to live in harmony with the natural world, and our traditional hunting and fishing practices do not destroy habitat, nor do our practices deplete animal populations or create waste. We use every part of the animal that we harvest. In other words, for thousands of years, Inuit have lived sustainably in our environment. We have been stewards of the land. All this wisdom, too, is threatened by the changing climate. That is to say, if we allow the Arctic to melt, we lose more than the planet that has nurtured us for all of human history. We lose the wisdom required for us to sustain it. And when I say I do not mean only Inuit, it's true. We are already among the first to be devastated by climate change, but we are not the only ones. Everything is connected through our common atmosphere, not to mention our common spirit and humanity. What affects one affects us all. The Arctic, after all, is the cooling system, the air conditioner, if you will, for the entire planet. As its ice and snow disappear, the globe's temperature rises faster and erratic weather becomes more frequent. This results in droughts, floods, tornadoes, and more intense hurricanes. Sea levels around the world rise, and small islands from the Caribbean to Florida to the South China Sea slip into the ocean. From the farmers in Australia to the fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico, or the homeowners of New Orleans, the devastation escalates. The future of Inuit is the future of the rest of the world. Our home is the barometer for what is happening to our entire planet.
And so I walked into Siila's house on that film shoot with Zacharias Kunuk, and we walked into her house, and I was walking into the home of one of my heroes. Siila Watt-Cloutier and the Indigenous Coalition from the circumpolar regions were very influential in getting the Stockholm Convention signed, ratified, and enforced in record time. Here's George W. Bush announcing his support for the treaty.
Secretary Powell and Administrator Whitman and I are pleased to make an announcement on the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. This international agreement would restrict the use of 12 dangerous chemicals, POPs as they are known, or the dirty dozen. I'm pleased to announce my support for the treaty and the intention of our government to sign and submit it for approval by the United States Senate.
It's one of the most successful UN treaties that has ever been made to protect the environment, to ban the dirty dozen, the persistent organic pollutants that contaminate food and contaminate human bodies. And she led the effort to get rid of these really nasty chemicals in the environment and was successful. And she's got a story to tell about that. That was deeply, deeply moving to me. She then went on to pioneer linking climate change and human rights in a way that has completely revamped how we think about climate change, like literally created disciplines, schools, journals, lawsuits, remapped the way in which we relate as a species to the issue. Is it profound? So when I walked into her house, I was like, wow, I'm walking into like one of these incredible, incredible moments of my life. She has honorary doctorates from dozens of universities. Most of the PICS universities have honored her with an honorary doctorate. And she is seen as that visionary leader that we all want to be interacting with. And so it was just very, very kind of logical to kind of try and make that connection. And Siila agreed and was interested. And so the podcast is a way to honor that and a way to share the time that she has had as this kind of inaugural fellow, the work that she's been doing on conscious climate leadership with a broader audience.
I think that there's been some impact, in the work that I have been doing over the years. It may seem slower, but I think that movement, I call it my quiet revolution, I think has been working with, a fair number of people and crowds across our country and beyond. And I think the recognition that I received for this work, I have I think 31 awards and 22 honorary doctorates, is testament to people getting it. And I have never thought that receiving this kind of recognition was about my ego being stroked. It was about my spirit being touched, and it was about others getting it in terms of the message. And I always saw it that way. And each time I was to receive recognition, it seemed always just before I was making my own breakthrough in my own inner journey. And it was, however we describe the higher power, the universe, God, it was that kind of affirmation that I felt I was receiving from the challenges of trying to get the world to understand who we were as a people and how negatively impacted that we have been by colonialism, historical traumas, and even the current systems that are not still necessarily working for us, that we have replicated so many systems from the Western world that we think they're ours, but in fact, we didn't design them. And we've got to start rethinking about how do we redesign them and working with people, like-minded people who are open to supporting my role. And Ian is one of them, certainly a major one, who has been very supportive in the way in which I work and the way in which I portray the issues and tell the stories, the real human stories behind the issues that very few people know about, where the world has come to know more about the Arctic for its wildlife than its people. And so I humanize these issues. And I think they have been an important part of shifting the ways in which people see the Arctic and see our people in the North.
Siila reads from her book.
It may be surprising to some that while fighting for the right to be cold has arguably been the hallmark of my life's work, I do not consider myself an environmental activist. I came to be involved in environmental issues through my global work as an elected leader advocating for my circumpolar Inuit community. An early job with the medical clinic in my hometown of Kuujjuaq gave me an intimate look at the challenges our people were facing. And in the following years, my work with both the Kativik School Board and the Nunavik Education Task Force provided more insight into the struggles and the barriers that our youth and our future were facing. But when I was elected as the corporate secretary of Makivik Corporation and the president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council Canada, I joined the international struggle to eliminate the persistent organic pollutants that were finding their way into Arctic waters, Inuit food sources, and Inuit bodies. From there, as an elected Inuk official and chair of ICC International, I was launched into international climate change politics. My work was global, but the protection of my Arctic homeland and my Inuit community always drove my efforts. While climate change became the focus of much of my work, it was clear to me that a holistic approach must be taken to heal the wounds that affect Inuit communities, historical traumas, current spiritual, social, health, and economic problems, all the environmental assaults on our way of life. Our challenges cannot be siloed or looked at in isolation. The story of the right to be cold is also in part the story of Inuit history and contemporary Inuit life through my lens. As an Inuk woman, a mother and grandmother who feels blessed to have been born into this remarkable culture, I wanted to offer a human story from this unique vantage point. In essence, the goal of my book is to share with the world the parallels I see between the safeguarding of the Arctic and survival of my Inuit culture. And writing The Right to be Cold is also my way of giving back to the people and the culture that have served not only as my grounding foundation, but also as the very anchor of my spirit as I was propelled into the rumble-tumble world of international politics. And that, in a nutshell, is, why I wrote this book, because it's just such an important piece where we have been so impacted on so many levels. And it was important to humanize these issues that most people had not been able to really do in the political arenas, where you're so caught up in the process of the political arena that you tend to forget how to tell the story in a way that touches the hearts and minds of people.
The same year Siila's book came out, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its 94 calls to action, calling for Canada to reckon with the legacy of residential schools and to begin a process of meaningful reconciliation with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Nearly a decade later, most of those calls remain unanswered. And yet, Indigenous people continue to demonstrate leadership. We continue to protect language, culture, and the land. We continue to carry memory forward, not only in resistance, but also in resilience.
Reconciliation is huge for us in this country, and many people have put a lot of work into ensuring that this is addressed, the issue of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of our country. And of course, the TRC, report that Murray Sinclair, bless him, he was just a wonderful, wonderful man, and so committed to these issues, was the head of that commission, along with his team. But yet, we are here today, and oftentimes people say, well, what has happened? Is there a real reconciliation happening? How is it? Where is it? And so on. It is. There's no doubt that it is. But have all of those recommendations been implemented, and have they been adhered to and listened to and so on? The TRC awakened a lot of people, but also the pandemic awakened a lot of people, because the pandemic also exposed a lot of the already existing weak systems that exist for health of Indigenous peoples and the vulnerable people, not just Indigenous, but the Black communities as well. And so it awakened us also to the larger picture of what have we done to our planet and where do we go from here.
Powerful and emotional ceremonies across the country today on this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Thousands gathered at a ceremony in Ottawa. An estimated 6,000 children died in residential schools, and more than 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend.
That allowed more Canadians to say, oh, that really happened, where people just kind of didn't really pay attention much to that until you start to really see the evidence of children's graves in these spaces where there was such violence and trauma and death. And so the hearts and minds of people started to open up a lot more during that period of time. There's a lot more that has to happen, but the building of that, the trusting relationships takes a lot of time. And getting back to the actual relationship with Ian and Pix now, is that building of trust is an important piece to reconciliation. It's a reciprocity between people that creates the movement, the bigger movements of change in policy, in universities, in all kinds of other systems that we're in today that need to be addressed and need to be changed, where you're disconnected to the communities, you're disconnected to people and the growth of people from an inner space, not just mind, academia or research or whatever, but it has to be from the heart. And personal transformation is one of those keys. And so if you can build those kinds of relationships, you can transform personally. And that's an important part of change today. And speaking of personal transformation, when I am asked at the end of my talks, what do we need to do now? Now that we know more about these issues from that Inuit Arctic lens, what can we do to help? And my first thing I always say is, well, first of all, don't be on a mission to save us, because that's the root cause of the problems that we face, is that everybody wanted to save us from way back from ourselves. And that is the root cause of the breakdown of our own identities, our own self-worthiness, our integrity, our resilience, our ingeniousness as Indigenous peoples. So don't go there. What you have to do is build relationships. And building relationships starts with your own personal transformation, because it's your own personal transformation that will then be able to allow you to change how you do things in your family, in the South or wherever you are, with your family, with your work, and the role that you play in the world. It starts with you. If you can change that, you are by then helping us in the Arctic. It's not about changing us, it's about changing yourself. And that's what I say to them. But I use this quote a lot because it's really has been important for me. And it's important, I think, for that personal transformation piece by Marianne Williamson, one of my most cherished authors who helped and guided me on my spiritual journey, who had the incredible, wonderful experience of meeting her in person in Mexico when we were both speaking together later on. She says this, quote, "Personal transformation can and does have global effects. As we go, so goes the world, for the world is us. And the revolution that will save the world is ultimately a personal one." And for me, that's very powerful because I think personal transformation can lead to that human revolution that we do need now. It really is. So, when you're building and moving towards reconciliation, you have to build that trust. And the world will come to those spaces at the speed of empathy, a deep understanding of one another, and the speed of trust will be built. It will be there. So that's how I see reconciliation happening, is building those kinds of trusting relationships and partnerships that are so important. It takes time. It takes time.
So I think, when we think about reconciliation, and again, as a settler, as somebody that doesn't come from an Indigenous background, it is about that relationship, and it is about genuinely showing up every day in a way that is about trying to make the best decision in every moment, that understands and is attempting to be aware of how that colonial history affects all of us, and how every day we can shift that narrative to something different, something better, something more respectful, and something that really does create partnerships for change that honor who people are, their diverse histories, and making sure that each moment we get a chance to course correct on that darkness to create a brighter future together.
This work that I'm doing now with this podcast and the work that I'm doing with PICS is an example of that equal partnership. It's about reciprocity. It's about trust, building trust, because I think that's what we need today, is to have that better understanding from that space of empathy, an understanding of one another, and building upon each other's strength to do this common work that needs to get done from both worlds, from both parties. And this is one way of really getting it out there, I think, because this, to me, is healing in real time. And this is reconciliation in real time. This is decolonizing in real time. And using this kind of medium now, when it's such a hot thing to do, I think is seizing the moment and really getting these messages out in a big way.
When I started my degree as a young Indigenous woman, I didn't necessarily have that guiding voice and that representation. I had to trust my identity to carry my research through in a good way. To have known somebody like Siila would have made my journey a little bit easier. And so I want to be that person for the people coming after me. Having this podcast is something that they can look towards to show we're using Indigenous wisdom, we're using Indigenous science, and here's all of the good that can come from that when we're talking about how to make a real difference in climate change. Siila is a force of nature, strong, compassionate, and connected. Her style of leadership is one that is always seeking to uplift the work of others. And with this podcast, Siila will have the opportunity not only to share her story, but to shine a light on the enduring work of Indigenous women. These leaders will inspire, educate, and illuminate the themes of each episode.
And the women that I will be interviewing, which includes Alika Hammond, former Premier of Greenland, Lena Ivik from Iqaluit, who runs and owns Birofik Center, who is a remarkable teacher of culture and language. But we will hear from her. And of course, Janna, who works at PICS. And we also have Nicole Redvers, university professor, First Nations, a remarkable, brilliant woman, author, writer, who I've had the privilege of working with her on a very big health document that will be out under the umbrella of the Lancet Journal, UK-based, very influential journal, on urgently addressing health issues of the circumpolar world. And so for me, it's really about highlighting women who are Indigenous women who are already functioning from or working from that space of heart and from that space of protection of what they love and from conscious leadership. And so for me, the podcast and the support that I'm receiving from PICS to do that has more meaning for me than one can even fathom. But it took a lot of courage for me to say, I'm coming back out. I'm really going to bring this out in a bigger way. And I feel that the potential of this was big. And that's why I'm doing it.
On the next episode of A Radical Act of Hope, we return to Siila's roots, to a small Arctic community shaped by ice, snow, and tradition. Because her leadership did not begin in courtrooms or at conferences. It began at home, on the land. In episode 2, we'll explore those early years and the foundations of one of the world's most respected climate voices. Siila sits down with Inuk educator Lena Ivik to talk about language, learning, and what it means to live in alignment with Inuit knowledge. Subscribe to A Radical Act of Hope wherever you get your podcasts. And visit climatesolutions.ca to learn more about how we're supporting climate action.
This podcast was made with respect, gratitude, and a radical act of hope by Everything Podcast and the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. PICS would like to thank the Gordon Foundation and the University of Victoria for their support of Siila's Indigenous Climate Fellowship and this podcast. Our hosts are Siila Watt-Cloutier, Janna Wale, and Ian Mauro. Our executive producer is Jennifer Smith, editor-in-chief Don Schaefer, showrunner Jessica Graychuk, our writers Eva Grant, sound design by Scott Whitaker, production support by Cindy McDougall. Thanks for listening.
This podcast was produced on the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking and WSÁNEĆ peoples. Our guests come from Indigenous lands across this country known as Canada and the world. Wherever you may be listening from, we thank you for joining us on this storytelling journey.
Another Everything Podcast production. Visit everythingpodcast.com, a division of Pattison Media. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast.